My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 72 years old. That morning, the church did not feel like a place of comfort. It felt like a cage. The heavy doors shut behind me, sealing me into a world that smelled of lilies, candle wax, and old wood polished too many times. The stained glass windows caught the sun, scattering colors across the pews, but no amount of holy light could soften the weight of the eyes fixed on me. At the front, just a few feet away, rested my husband's coffin, a man I had shared 50 years with, now reduced to silence and wood and brass handles. I wanted to grieve, I wanted to weep, but the whispers around me drowned out the hymns. "She's just the widow," a woman hissed behind her black veil, her voice sharper than the organ's notes. "Doesn't even know how he ran things." Another chuckled, cruel amusement dripping from every word. Their pity wasn't soft. It was a blade, sharpened and aimed directly at me. I stood, hands folded tight, black veil trembling with each shallow breath. And that was when the chilling truth pressed into my bones. They weren't mourning him. They were judging me. To them, I was nothing more than the shadow left behind, fragile, fading, a woman who would disappear as soon as his name was carved into stone. The priest spoke, his voice solemn, but I could feel the congregation's eyes wandering, measuring me. Even in grief, they looked at me not as a wife, not as a partner, but as an empty vessel. When the service ended, we moved into the reception hall. That's where the disdain sharpened. His brother leaned close, wearing that pitying smile people reserve for the weak. He patted my hand as if I were a helpless child. "Don't worry," he said softly, almost sweetly. "We'll take care of everything now." The words cut deeper than any insult. "We'll take care of everything," as if I hadn't stood beside my husband through every season, through poverty and prosperity. As if I hadn't built a life with him brick by brick. Around me, his colleagues whispered, their voices like gnats buzzing in my ears. "She won't last a month handling his affairs. She was never involved. She was just there." Across the room, my daughter-in-law raised her glass. Her smile was thin, mocking, her eyes gleaming with the cruel joy of someone watching a crown fall. She toasted, not to my husband's memory, but to the end of my story. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't even begin to imagine, was that grief wasn't the only thing my husband had left me. He had left me something else, something hidden, something that would change everything. That night, when the last guest had gone and the house was swallowed in silence, I sat alone in his armchair. It still smelled of him, tobacco, cedar, and something warm I could never quite name. I closed my eyes, letting the silence press down until my chest ached. For 50 years, that chair had been his throne. Now it was empty, and so was I. But my hands traced the worn armrests, and memories came flooding back, nights when he stumbled in past midnight, shirt collar undone, eyes tired but alive. I used to tease him. "What keeps you up so late?" He would only smile, that secret knowing smile and whisper, "Someday you'll understand." At the time, I thought it was business. Numbers, contracts, things too complicated for me. And maybe part of me believed them all, believed that I was just a wife, too fragile to matter. But deep down, I always sensed there was something more. That night, grief and clarity tangled inside me until I could barely breathe. I pulled his old coat around my shoulders, hoping for comfort. And that was when I felt it, something cold, hidden in the pocket. My fingers closed around a small brass key. I froze, my heart hammering so hard it rattled my ribs. This wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate. He hadn't left me with nothing. He had trusted me all along, and for the first time since the coffin closed, the grief inside me cracked open, just enough for fire to flicker where despair had been. Because this key wasn't only for a safe, it was for me, for who he believed I truly was. The reception hall was filled with the clinking of glasses and the dull hum of forced laughter. People clustered in corners, speaking in voices that carried just loud enough for me to hear. I sat near the edge of the long banquet table, the black veil still clinging to my face, as though it could shield me from their stares. It didn't. My brother-in-law, Harold, the self-proclaimed businessman of the family, leaned across the table with that smug smile of his. His cologne reeked of arrogance as he patted my hand again, this time harder, as though he were stamping his claim on my life. "Evelyn," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Don't trouble yourself with the estate. You've never managed these things before, and you shouldn't start now. It's better for all of us if you leave it to people who understand how the world works." The guests chuckled, the sound soft but sharp like knives hidden in laughter. I tried to steady my hands on the tablecloth, but then my son, Daniel, joined in. My own flesh and blood. He raised his glass high, his eyes gleaming the way they used to when he won Little League games. But this time it wasn't pride, it was greed. "Uncle's right," Daniel said loudly, making sure everyone heard. "Mom's always been delicate. Dad took care of everything for a reason. She shouldn't have to worry about numbers or contracts. She belongs at home with her tea and her roses." The room erupted with light laughter, and I felt my chest tighten. For a moment, I wasn't his mother. I was their joke. And then came the final sting. My daughter-in-law, Veronica, glided across the floor in her silk dress, her smile as polished as the diamonds around her neck. She raised her glass, eyes locked on mine, and spoke in that voice people use when they want the world to notice. "To Evelyn," she announced, "the woman who gave us so much and now, finally, gets to rest. Rest, as if I were already dead." The guests applauded lightly, some nodding in agreement. In that moment, the air was heavier than grief. It was suffocating with dismissal. They weren't just ignoring me. They were erasing me right there in front of everyone. I lowered my gaze to the table, the silverware catching the light like cold blades. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the truth pressing against my ribs. They had already buried me alongside him. But what none of them knew was that the brass key in my pocket burned hotter with every insult, with every laugh, with every glass raised against me. They thought they had ended my story, but my story was only beginning. That night, long after the last laugh at my expense had faded, I sat alone in the silence of the house. The brass key lay heavy in my palm, small but impossible to ignore. Every time I closed my hand around it, memories surfaced. Fragments I had once brushed aside, but now burned with new meaning. I remembered a night years ago, when I had wandered into his study after midnight. The desk lamp was still on, papers scattered across the polished oak. I had teased him gently, another late meeting with numbers. He had looked up at me with that secret smile, the one that always felt like he was carrying a truth too big to share. He closed a folder quickly, slid it into the safe, and kissed me on the forehead. "Someday," he whispered, "you'll see why this matters." At the time, I thought it was just business. Now, I wondered if the someday had arrived. Another memory followed. A family dinner, the whole table buzzing with conversation. His brother bragged about investments, Veronica sparkled in her jewels, and my son barely looked up from his plate. I had asked my husband, half joking, "Do they really think I don't understand any of this?" He didn't answer them. Instead, he took my hand beneath the table, squeezed it firmly, and said, "They'll underestimate you until the day they can't." I had laughed then, thinking it was just comfort. But tonight, the words struck like prophecy, and then there was the night of the storm. The power had gone out, the house rattling with wind. I lit candles and found him in the study, calmly placing documents into a fireproof box. I asked, "Why keep all of this hidden?" He paused, his face lit only by the flicker of the candle, and replied, "Because the world won't protect what matters most. That's my job until it becomes yours." I hadn't understood, but now the pieces locked together as tightly as the tumblers in his safe. The brass key grew warmer in my hand, no longer just an object but a message. He had been preparing me all along, not with instructions but with trust. And for the first time in days, I felt something stir inside me. Not grief, not fear, but resolve. Because his secrets weren't meant to exclude me. They were meant to arm me. The house was still that night, heavy with the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. I sat in the study, his study, surrounded by the smell of leather and old tobacco, shadows stretching long across the bookshelves. The brass key weighed in my hand like a question demanding an answer. I rose slowly, my steps careful on the hardwood floor, until I stood before the safe. It was hidden behind the heavy oak cabinet, the same one I had dusted for years without daring to wonder what lay beneath. My hands shook as I pulled the cabinet aside, the scrape of wood against wood echoing through the room like thunder. There it was, the safe, cold, unyielding, a silent sentinel of his secrets. For a long moment I hesitated. My breath caught, tears stung my eyes. Opening it felt like tearing open our marriage all over again, facing all the nights I had doubted, all the times I had accepted being just the wife. But the key was already burning against my skin. With trembling fingers, I slid it into the lock. The metal groaned, a click sharp and final as a gavel. The door creaked open. Inside was not chaos, not forgotten scraps. It was order, meticulous, deliberate. A leather folder sat squarely in the center, its brass clasp gleaming even in the dim light. Beneath it, boxes of documents stamped with seals, contracts neatly bound, bank ledgers that spoke of far more than I ever knew existed. My knees almost gave out, but it wasn't the papers that undid me. Resting on top of the folder was a single envelope, my name written across it in his unmistakable hand. The handwriting I had seen on birthday cards, on grocery lists, on the back of love notes tucked into my apron pockets 50 years ago. I sank into his chair, the envelope trembling in my hands. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It felt like he was sitting right beside me again. I pressed it to my lips before tearing it open, as though it could hold his warmth a second longer. His words spilled across the page, steady and certain, just as his voice had always been. To my beloved wife, if they doubt you, let this prove what I always knew. You are the only one I trust with everything I built. This file holds the truth of our legacy, and it belongs to you. Tears blurred the ink, but I kept reading, my voice breaking only once. The words weren't just a declaration, they were a shield, a weapon, a crown placed gently but firmly on my head. For years they had called me fragile, invisible, an afterthought, but in his final act he had erased every lie they whispered about me. He had seen me, trusted me, chosen me. I clutched the folder to my chest, the letter still open on the desk. The weight of grief shifted, replaced by something steadier, stronger. Resolve. Because this wasn't just paper. This was truth. This was power. And when the time came, I would use it. The next day, the reception hall glittered with chandeliers and the hollow sound of forced cheer. The air smelled of wine and roast meat, but underneath it all was the stench of arrogance. They had gathered not to mourn, but to calculate, each smile a mask, each whisper a ledger. I sat quietly at the edge of the long oak table, the brass key tucked safely away, the leather folder heavy in my lap. My veil no longer covered my face. I wanted them to see me. Every line, every wrinkle, every ounce of grief. The noise of chatter filled the hall until I rose. The scrape of my chair against the floor silenced the laughter in an instant. Dozens of eyes turned to me, expecting fragility, expecting collapse. Instead, I placed the folder in the center of the table. The brass clasp snapped open with a sound that echoed like thunder against the marble walls. You all think I was just his wife. I began, my voice trembling at first but hardening with each word. Just the widow, a shadow, but he left me something and it wasn't pity. The hall fell into a heavy silence. Forks stilled midair. Glasses hovered half-raised. I opened the folder, and the papers spoke louder than I ever could. Bank records, deeds, contracts stamped with seals of power. And then on top, the letter, his handwriting, his voice reborn in ink. I read aloud. To my beloved wife, if they doubt you, let this prove what I always knew. You are the only one I trust with everything I built. This file holds the truth of our legacy, and it belongs to you. My throat tightened, but my voice grew steadier with every word. When I looked up, the room was no longer filled with whispers. It was filled with silence, sharp, suffocating silence. My brother-in-law's smug grin collapsed. My daughter-in-law's glass trembled, a thin crack spidering down the crystal. Even my son, my own son, stared at me as if he had never truly seen me before. And then the storm broke. Daniel shot to his feet, his face red with fury. "This is a lie!" he shouted, his fist slamming the table so hard the silverware rattled. Dad would never leave everything to her. His voice cracked, not with grief, but with rage and fear. Veronica leapt to his side, her voice sharp as shattered glass. "She doesn't know how to manage a company. She barely knows how to write a check. This has to be forged." The guests erupted, whispers bursting into arguments, accusations flying like daggers across the room. Faces twisted with greed, with doubt, with fear. Through it all, I stood unmoving. The letter still in my hand, my husband's words burning in my chest. A strange calm settled over me, steady and unyielding. I could almost hear his voice, low, certain, reminding me, "Stand tall. Let them reveal themselves." And then the doors opened. Our family lawyer entered, his polished shoes striking the floor like a drumbeat. In his hands, a sealed envelope. He placed it on the table and cleared his throat, his voice carrying above the chaos. "All documents have been verified," he announced, each word crisp as a verdict. "Mr. Carter's will was updated 6 months ago. His sole executor," he paused, eyes meeting mine, "is his wife." The room froze. Every accusation, every smirk, every whisper collapsed into stunned silence. My brother-in-law's face drained of color. My son's fists shook, but no words came. Veronica's glass slipped, wine spilling across the white tablecloth like blood. I lifted my chin, meeting their eyes one by one. My voice was steady, though my heart ached with the betrayal that stood before me. "You called me just the widow," I said softly, though the words struck sharper than any blade. But I was his partner every step of the way. He trusted me, not you, not your greed, not your schemes. The silence that followed was heavier than grief, sharper than judgment. For the first time since his coffin closed, I felt it power, not borrowed, not given. Mine. The hall remained frozen long after the lawyer's words settled into the air. I could feel the tension in the room, thick as smoke, pressing against the silence that no one dared break. Their power had evaporated in an instant, leaving nothing but pale faces and clenched fists. Slowly, deliberately, I gathered the papers back into the leather folder. Each page slid into place with a quiet finality, as if sealing not just the documents, but every lie they had ever spoken about me. My fingers no longer trembled. My shoulders no longer sagged. For the first time since the funeral began, I stood tall. "I was never just his widow," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "I was his partner, his choice, his legacy, and now you'll have to see me for who I am." I turned to the lawyer. "Prepare everything," I commanded, as though the decision had always been mine. He nodded firmly, no hesitation. "Of course, Mrs. Carter." The title struck me like a bell, not pitying, not dismissive, but solid, respectful. "Mrs. Carter, the executor, the keeper of our name." As I walked out of the hall, I felt the heat of their stares follow me. Some burned with fury, others sagged with regret, but none dared to stop me. Behind me, the clinking of glasses and forced laughter had vanished, replaced with the heavy silence of defeat. That night, I returned to the cemetery. The lilies laid out on his grave swayed gently in the cool evening air, their fragrance soft against the chill. I knelt by the headstone, the leather folder resting against the stone as if it belonged there. My hand traced his name, carved deep into the granite, solid and eternal. "Rest easy," I whispered, my voice trembling with something between grief and gratitude. "They'll never erase me again." A breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of cedar and tobacco, his scent, still clinging to the night air. And for the first time since the coffin closed, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen. I felt strong, because I was never just the widow. I was the legacy.